All right, everybody, we're back with the next subsection for this part of our policy course. And today we're going to talk about how and why things get onto a politician's agenda. So, first off, we have to distinguish between a policy agenda and policy priorities. Policy agenda just kind of means it's going to be looked at, right? Policy agenda is just something that they're going to spend some amount of time on, whereas policy priorities are kind of a ranked policy agenda. These things are the most important, these things are the least important. So just getting onto a policy agenda is good, but the higher you can get in policy priorities, the better, because that's going to get the most attention and the soonest attention. And so organizations and groups that want the government or other policy making apparatus to do something definitely want to be on the policy agenda, but maybe even more important is they want to be high on that policy priorities list, right? Now, one of the things that might shape whether it's on the agenda or not, or how high in the rankings it is for the priorities, is framing. And this is where two disagreeing groups will kind of talk about the problem in very different terms and make it seem like almost two completely different problems. Perfect example here is gun control. So on one side, you have people framing gun control as trying to save lives. We need to restrict access to guns so that the murder rate goes down, children aren't shot and killed either accidentally or on purpose, school shootings, mass shootings, all a big issue. We can help reduce that kind of gun crime if we restrict access in some level, in some way, to guns. Whereas the other side is going to frame that exact same issue as a matter of rights. We have the Second Amendment rights to guns, and we shall not infringe on that right to own a gun. And so it's the exact same issue, but it's framed in two very different ways by the two groups that are advocating for their side in front of Congress or the Supreme Court or whoever, right? So just because something is on an agenda doesn't necessarily mean it's being framed in a way that you or I might agree with. Now, there's also kind of two different subsets of agenda, and this is a little bit gray, a little bit nuanced, but there's what experts have kind of dubbed the systematic agenda, which is a little more abstract, a little more just kind of what are people talking about? What are people, sending letters to the editor about? What are Congress members talking about in the lunchroom? What are they kind of, what are people spending time and energy discussing or thinking about, right? And then there's the institutional agenda, which is much more specific. And the things on the systematic agenda will probably make it onto the institutional agenda in some form, but in a much more specific context. So the systematic agenda, we might have crime. Whereas on the institutional agenda, we might have things like a new law to increase the number of police officers, or more funding for pre-K programs, or, much more specific things than that. And a lot of this is what political junkies tend to call inside baseball, right? So this is the stuff that you really have to be paying attention to, both politics and the kind of subset area that the agenda item belongs to really know the ins and outs of what's happening and what's actually being proposed and how this law will actually work, which takes a lot of time and effort for people to pay attention to. So most people don't. They just pay attention to the much broader, there's a crime bill going through Congress, rather than, okay, that crime bill would do these specific things, change these specific policies, etc., etc. This institutional agenda is going to be very different for different government groups, Congress, the president, the courts, etc. And it's going to be different for different levels of government. So state governments are going to have much different institutional agendas than the federal government. Local governments are going to have much different institutional agendas than state governments. And this is in some part created by the fact that they have different jobs, right? The federal government has a job to govern the entire country. They only have certain constitutional powers, whereas state governments have a much broader range of policy priorities, much different governing habits, right? Because remember, a lot of state legislators work only part-time. So their agendas are going to be affected by the fact that they only work part-time. Now, there's also on the institutional agenda, there's the mandatory and the discretionary. The mandatory agenda is stuff they kind of have to do, or at least it's very strongly suggested that they do. Things like, the budget for the government for the coming year. Whereas discretionary things are things that they could do, they could not do. It's really up to them, right? So a lot of times the federal government's spending is looked at in these same terms. The mandatory spending and the discretionary spending. The mandatory spending is spending that has been set by laws passed a long time ago. So it's things like Social Security. That is money that the U.S. government has to pay out. It's already on the books as required. Whereas discretionary spending is what Congress chooses to allocate money to, right? And then, of course, the institutional agenda has minor and major issues. The minor issues are things like passing a law about pollution in one minor river in some small state. Whereas the major issues are going to be things like, government-run healthcare and national infrastructure spending and things like that. So a lot of that minor and major is not necessarily the same as policy priorities. It's usually the major stuff is a higher priority and the minor stuff is a lower priority, but not always. Now, Kingdon kind of looks at this as things get onto the government agenda when these three streams, as he called them, kind of converge, right? So first you have to have a problem, and that problem has to be kind of serious enough to get on the government radar. The second is policy proposals. Somebody has to have an idea of something to do about it, or it has to be possible for some policy to be created, or has already been created, or is in the process of being created. And then the politics stream. Who's in office right now, both the president and what's the makeup of Congress? Did they run on this issue or run against this issue? So when those three things kind of converge, an issue will get put onto the agenda of either some government agency or many government agencies. Now, when trying to determine what your agenda is going to be, how does the president look at it? Well, experts have kind of come together and said that there are three reasons, three factors that a president will use to determine whether something should be on their agenda or not. Okay? So the first is the electoral benefits. Is this going to help the president when they run for re-election? Is it going to help them? Is it going to help their party when it comes to the midterm elections or whatever the next congressional election is? Are the people going to like it and thus vote for either that president or members of their party because that policy was passed and they get to run on it and make TV commercials that say, hey, we passed this policy thing. That's really good. Vote for our party again. The second is historical achievement. Is this going to be seen by history as something that is good or beneficial or awesome? And there have been a lot of presidents that are kind of higher ranked or even remembered by the public lots more because of the things they did while in office that were major policy kind of initiatives. Obviously, probably the biggest one is Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, right? We all love Lincoln. He's, in rankings of presidents, both by experts and by just American citizens, Lincoln is almost always number one or bare minimum like number two, because of those policy decisions and his agenda in office and these things he did while he was president. There have also been really big agenda items that have kind of been linked to different presidents throughout our country's history. There was Nixon and going to China and opening up relationships with China. I mean, there was, there was John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts. There was Barack Obama and the Affordable Care Act, right? George Bush Jr. and the 9/11 response. All those things have kind of either helped or hurt those presidents be remembered, better or worse, by kind of us, the people who come after them, right? And then, of course, third is it good policy? Is this going to help? Is this going to help people? Is it going to help the country? Is it going to help, crime? Is it going to help unemployment? Is it going to help any of these other factors? But those are the three things that presidents look at when they decide what should be on the agenda and what shouldn't. Now, Congress gets a lot more complicated because, of course, Congress is composed of, 535 people. So they have lots of different ideas of what should happen, what shouldn't happen, lots of different interests on what's important and what's not important, right? So some groups, whether Democrat or Republican, or even groups within groups, certain sectors of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, they're going to have different policy, not only ideas, but priorities. And the committee and subcommittee process just kind of makes this even worse, if you will. So some Congress people might really care about pollution, and we need to work on the environment, and global warming is really important. Other Congress members might have run on and gotten elected on farm subsidies, and we need to help rural farmers, and we need to make sure that these farms aren't collapsing and going out of business and driving up the price of food. So they're going to have huge disagreements, and there's going to be a lot of negotiating, which comes in the next section, spoiler alert, about what gets onto the agenda and what doesn't, what's high priority and what's not. So this is a giant, confusing, a lot of times inexplicable process for Congress at the national level, definitely, and at some level even on the state level. Now, courts also have a role in putting policy on the agenda, but it's usually not their agenda. It's usually the agendas of Congress or the president. Now, sometimes it is their agenda because courts get to decide what cases, upper level, appeals level courts or the Supreme Court, they get to decide what cases they take. And thus their agenda is kind of entirely self-determined. They get to decide what cases they want to hear and rule on and what cases they don't. So in that sense, they do get to set their own agenda. On the other hand, what's probably more common is them to put things on the agenda of one of the other sections of government. So for instance, if a court at any level determines that a new law passed by Congress is unconstitutional because of this one certain section or the way this phrase is put into this law, then it gets onto Congress's agenda to kind of pass that law again, but fix that issue that the court has pointed out, right? Or if the court says, we're ruling this way because we think the intent of this law was to do this, and Congress says, no, it wasn't. We had a completely different intent when we wrote that law. They can write a new law to clarify what they meant and thus kind of overrule that court decision or change that court decision or make it so that court will decide something different the next time a case like that comes in front of it. Now, other things that can put things on an agenda item, kind of the scariest, if you will, is a crisis. 9/11, or a hurricane, or a mass shooting event, or some kind of really big, really kind of impactful, heavily covered by the media event that might cause Congress to put those issues onto their agenda very quickly, right? So if something big happens, if something usually bad happens, Congress is going to get right on it and put that on their agenda list very quickly. The media also has a role in setting agendas because, what the media talks about, the people talk about, and what the people talk about, politicians talk about in that kind of informal agenda I talked about earlier. And thus the media has a role in not necessarily telling people what to think, but telling people what to think about. Because if the media really wants action on some agenda item, they're going to run news story after news story after news story about that item. And, movies and television shows are going to kind of insert that issue into their plot lines. And that really kind of has the ability to cause the people to demand that agenda item get put onto the agendas for Congress or the president or the governor or whoever. Changes in statistical indicators, i.e. the unemployment rate or the crime rate or the price of wheat, right? All of those kind of numbers go up and down all the time. And if there is a rapid change or a sustained long-term change, either up or down, that is going to put issues onto the agenda of everybody and anybody who wants to be seen fixing that problem or doing something about this issue. And then, of course, there's political changes, right? The agenda for Congress is going to be much different when the Democrats control both the House and the Senate, or when the Republicans control both the House and the Senate, or when one party controls one and one party controls the other, as is the case as I'm recording this, or one party controls the Senate and another party controls the House. That kind of division of power between the two parties definitely changes what gets put on the agenda. All right. There are lots of groups, no matter what subject you're talking about, there are lots of groups that don't want to do anything about it. They don't want to change the status quo. They don't want the government or the president or whoever to change policy or enact new policy or whatever. And they have lots of chances to do this because any policy going through this process has lots and lots of spots where it can be kind of ignored or shot down or deleted from the agenda list, right? So there are organizations and groups, no matter the topic, that will try and come in, and at every step along that path, they're going to try and get this policy discarded, right? And so a lot of the techniques they use to do that are to deny there's a problem at all. Say, oh, global warming's not an issue, or oh, crime is really low. You don't have to worry about fixing crime. Or this is a problem that the government can't do anything about, right? This is the job of somebody else to fix. You can't stop hurricanes. You can't, the government, it's not within the government's power to go in and do these things. Or, this proposed policy might help this, but it's the negatives far outweigh the positives. Look at all the damage that we're going to do to the economy or the environment or whatever you're proposing to do about this problem is just going to create bigger problems. Or the private sector can fix this. Why, we don't need government to do this. We can have private companies and investment and those groups can come in and fix this problem. Or we don't know enough about this yet. We need to study this more. We need to have more time and more science and more papers written up about what exactly is going on here because we don't have enough information to pass this policy. Or, of course, there's the old favorite, let the voters decide, right? The midterms are coming up, or the presidential election's coming up, and we should let the voters vote based on this issue and see who wins to know whether we should do something about this issue or not. So these are often very, very successful because, again, there's so many chances for it to be successful. And if you want some policy passed or implemented, you have to win every time. If you want some policy killed off, you only have to win once in any of those many, many steps that policy is going through. All right. That's enough for this subsection. We're going to take one more break. I'll be right back.